I vowed when I left the city 6 years ago that I'd never do any more work on the city again, but that didn't work. That didn't happen. So this is some new work I've done in Johannesburg as a non-resident. All my previous work was done while I lived there. And the distance has actually enabled me to take to see the city very differently. And to work on something which I don't think I would have worked on had I still been living there. So that's what I'm going to... The paper is called Rising Acid Mine Water, a Dissident Element. Maybe just... here's the water. Thank you. Can I start, Karen? Is that okay? Yeah. Sure. All right, so... This new work that I've recently developed is an examination of the geological as a vibrant force in contemporary life. It's a chronicle or a fable about a geological incursion into human affairs that became not only a privileged moment when previously invisible processes of the commodification of nature became visible, but it also became a proposition around which new forms of political life have assembled. So I'm interested in how geology starts to assemble political life around itself. Right, now this is where I just need to see if I can get this little movie to work. I don't think I'm going to be able to, no. It's in the middle here, this middle section. Can you see how to do that? Right. Okay. So this is just a quick little movie that kind of gives you some idea of this kind of water as it emerged and is flowing across the countryside. I'm going to do the theory bit at the beginning to give you some idea of the sort of theoretical framework within which I've located this work. It brings together three sets of ideas. The first is from Maria Kaika, who I gather that you've read before, from her book, City of Flows, Modernity, Nature and the City, in which she argues that when invisible networks fail, in other words, when water pipes leak, or when the electricity grid goes down, or when garbage piles up, these become privileged moments when the underlying contradictions of urban life are exposed. So it was when something failed about gold mining in Johannesburg that new things became possible. The second set of ideas I draw from are from Bruno Latour's ideas in Politics of Nature, and this is the idea of a proposition. A proposition is an association of humans and non-humans before it becomes a fully fledged member of the collective. So in this talk, I'm really arguing that this water I'm going to talk about is a proposition. It's something about which no one is quite sure what to do with. And this uncertainty inaugurates new and unforeseen associations and mobilizes new publics in search of some kind of answer to this thing that no one quite knows what to do with. And then the third set of ideas, which I don't really develop very much in the talk, are ideas drawn from Jacques Rancière's idea of politics in The Politics of Aesthetics, in which he argues that the political is a reordering of the distribution of the sensible. In other words, it's a kind of rearrangement of the sensible, when that which has no right to be counted as a speaking being makes itself of some account. So I'll go into that in a little bit later in the talk. Okay, so much for the theoretical framework. Now I'm going to get into my fable. In their introduction to Johannesburg, the Elusive Metropolis, editors Sarah Nuttall and Achille Mbembe proposed that Johannesburg's section, the connection between its underground world of mine shafts, tunnels, and labour, and above-ground world of towers, commerce, and capital, holds the secrets to its modernity. So they introduced this idea of the section as holding the secrets to the city. They challenge spatial readings of the city that remain locked into the plan. And this is the standard kind of diagram of the apartheid city. It shows the kind of racial segregation, the kind of centralized business district. And this is the trope or the image through which apartheid cities are usually understood, the plan. Sarah and Achille argue that actually it's in the section that we've got to understand this city, and that the plan is only a consequence of the section. So they argue that it was in depth that the calculus of capital and dispossession, technology, labor, and the unequal distribution of wealth operated. The discovery of gold on the Witwatersrand. This is another image of the city and the mine dumps, which I wanted to show you. So the idea of the kind of underground worlds of the mining and the above-ground world of the city, which, as you can see in the plan, is divided here. This is the city here, this is the mining land here, and even the kind of highways start to separate out that kind into an above and a below. The discovery of gold on the Witwatersrand in 1886 that gave rise to the exploitation of the world's largest gold reserves inaugurated new associations of air and earth, science and politics, humans and non-humans. Very rapidly, these were organized into two distinct realms: an above-ground world of capital, commerce, culture and politics. Let me go back to that slide there. And a below-ground world of labor, minerals, rocks, and science. The overlap, or the threshold, between these two worlds was intensely policed, yet it was always unstable and in danger of collapsing. In this paper, I examine the role of cartography, of mapping, in keeping these two worlds apart. And then I go on to look at forms of aesthetic practice that revealed their coexistence and their connectedness. I then turn to a recent geological moment when toxic water decanted from mining voids, and argue that this recalibrated this politics of verticality and mapped what could become a different kind of future. Okay, to just talk a little bit about the geology of the Witwatersrand of Johannesburg. The Witwatersrand goldfields are both the richest in the world and the most disputed issue in the history of economic geology. A number of contested theories explain its origins, and this is a diagram of one of those theories, that in fact it was a sedimentary process that brought the gold from somewhere else into a lake, and that the gold was sort of lapping up against the sides of this now disappeared large inland sea. All that has been agreed, however, is that since 3 billion years ago, 5 major geological events, one of which was a crashing meteorite, have introduced or mobilized gold deposits, along with high concentrations of other metals like uranium, pyrite, and carbon, and introduced gold into the cavities of a sort of conglomerate of rock. This has produced a fractured, dense network of layers, fractures, and faults, in which gold is found as tiny specks or grains or veins, in a seam anything from a couple of centimeters to a little over a meter thick, sloping at an angle of 22 degrees towards the south. In this map here, this here is the line of gold. Okay, so the gold slopes down from the surface where it was discovered at an angle of 22 degrees, approximately to the south. Because of this sloping seam, this has produced the deepest gold mines in the world. And this is an image of the deepest gold mine, which is in fact 3,9 3,900 meters deep. It's nearly 4 kilometers deep, this mine. By comparison, to give you some idea of how deep that is, the world's tallest building, the Burj Khalifa in Dubai, is 830 meters tall. It's 21% high as this mine is deep. And this is an extraordinary map that was actually sketched by a mining engineer, which shows all the kind of stopes and tunnels of this mine under the ground. The different colors are different depths of tunnels. It comprises 800 kilometers of underground tunnels. The journey to the rock face takes an hour, and at the rock face, temperatures rise to 60 degrees centigrade. Why I give you these details is to argue that clearly this is a technological network that's comparable in complexity to a tall building. It comprises shafts, tunnels, dams, pumping stations, circuits, elevators, ropes and cables, etc., that lower and distribute water, air, electricity, dynamite, equipment, people between surface and depth constantly. It is, in fact, the epitome of Walter Benjamin's urban hell, invisible underneath the urban heaven of the city, or the gold bullion, or the shareholders' annual report, in which it is disguised. These are some drawings of kind of water reticulation systems underground. So maintenance of this disguise relied on syntaxes of concealment and separation. And that's really what the apartheid city was about. Scientific reports, racialized institutions, race thinking, capitalist divisions of labor, bioregulatory politics, planning, urban design, etc., all of which work towards maintaining a dualism between the underground and the surface, and keeping the underground out of sight. This here is a map of Johannesburg just post-apartheid, which I wanted to use, sorry, very bad quality. This is the white city, this is the black city, this is the mining belt, okay. You have a completely kind of, the city is organized around this division that I'm talking about. This here is quite a famous photograph of David Goldblatt's. It's of a post office during the apartheid years with a door for whites and a door for blacks. Okay, and after apartheid ended, they just bricked this one up. Very easy to kind of make these changes. And this is actually an image of a mining hostel where you can see how labor itself was kind of completely separated from the rest of the landscape into this sort of concentration camp-like arrangement. Okay, just some sort of small illustrations of what I'm talking about. Cartography or mapping contributed to this erasure. Just very briefly, this here is a map of a mine underground. The dark sort of patched parts of the map show the underground that has been tunneled, that has been stoped. So this is the void underground. And this kind of area that's being mapped is in fact this area here. It's the subdivision of a particular mine. What I find so extraordinary is this lies underneath two small towns. Okay, so the mine actually goes underneath two small towns, but the map never shows the towns above them. So there's this complete disjunction between maps of the underworld and maps of the city above. I'm going to illustrate this with a couple more examples. The first is a plan of Johannesburg drawn 10 years after gold was discovered in 1896. As you can see, the map shows street grids, major urban spaces, railway lines, townships, surface landscape features, etc. And they're all clearly articulated and named. South of the city over here, mines are named and drawn as bounded surface with no registration of their underground topography or even of the location of their shafts or surface workings. The only indication that this is a map of a mining town, in fact, is this little table at the bottom here, which indicates amount of gold mined per year for the 10 years since gold was discovered. The second map, drawn in the same year, is a sectional drawing cutting through the earth, 2 inclined gold reefs, as you can see, a mine shaft and 8 underground tunnels. There's no indication of that identity or location of the mine, other than that it is approaching its southern property boundary, which is indicated right on that side of the drawing. Whereas in the first map, the city was only drawn in plan, in the second, the mine is only drawn in section. Ground surface has ceased to be important. It is a wavy line. As you can see, the surface is a wavy line subsumed by a firm level datum from which subterranean levels are measured. So we can see that the 2 maps privilege different views and offer different readings of space, one pertaining to the above-ground city, the other to the below-ground mine. Even when mining maps are drawn in plan, and this is a map of all the kind of mining surfaces, each one of those sort of patchwork areas is a different mine. So even when mines are drawn in plan, what happens is the cities disappear. Johannesburg now becomes just a name underlined with a line. So suddenly the sort of city disappears from view. In other words, city maps and mining maps did not speak to one another at all. It was in the forms of visibility of aesthetic practice that dissension against this rigid delineation of above and below was formulated, and where the overlap between the two was depicted and recomposed. One of the most striking evocations of this is artist William Kentridge's animated film Mine, and these are just a few stills from the animation. In it, Soho Eckstein, a mining magnate, prepares his morning coffee by pushing down the plunger of a French coffee press. Instead of stopping at the bottom of the pot, it bores through the table and the floor and drills a deep shaft through into the stopes of a mine below. The plunge of the coffee press instantly unites the world of mine owner and mine worker with Kentridge's own autobiography through the personal pronoun mine. This lays out a new narrative terrain for figuring out the city and personal history as entanglements of surface and depth, and in which accounts that only acknowledge surface incidents and accidents are shown to be inadequate. I'm going to talk about another artist that I didn't talk about last time, John. This is the work of a woman artist called Jeanette, appropriately Unite, spelled unite. She's an artist who has worked for 2 decades researching the mining industry in South Africa. And she has done an amazing series of drawings, and this is one of them, from a series called Above Below. These are large photo montages made up of 2 separate images, one of mining headgear, the above-ground world of the mine, and the other of the underground worlds of tunnels and stopes. And what she does is she works the area of transition between the 2 images with swirling expressionistic markings, such that if you block off the bottom part of the image, that threshold appears to belong to the top part, and if you visually block off the top part, that intermediary section looks like the ceiling of the bottom part. So, an art critic argues, what this does is she has generated a profound ambiguity, a zone where what is represented is neither one thing nor another, but both things at the same time. The artist has created a zone of dynamic uncertainty in which the mark is in a state of flux, ambiguity, and constant becoming. It is no accident that the pastels that Unité draws with to make these marks are handmade and contain metal oxides and grindings salvaged from mine dumps. And then the final project is an architectural one. I had to include one for the architects present, myself included. This is a project that was conceptualized and designed by a colleague when we taught together in Johannesburg in 1986, exactly 100 years after the discovery of gold. His name is Ivan Cady. In this project, Ivan traced the connection between the grid of the original triangle of ground that was Johannesburg. This was the original triangle of ground that was given to the city of Johannesburg to be founded on. So he traces this grid and rotates it through 90 degrees, translating the plan of the city into the section of a building that resembled both the shape of a mine's headgear and a yacht's sail. Primary streets in the city plan were translated into pilotis, which extended into a subterranean network of mining tunnels. This structure floated in a pool of water whose edge was delineated by the city's southern freeway, marking the ancient inland ocean shoreline where gold sediment had settled. Cady speaks of this as revealing the city's underbelly and exposing its secrets. In one rendering of the building from below, a rust-colored patina creeps up its structure, foretelling of the acid mine water that would rise and threaten the city nearly 20 years later. Water and deep-level gold mining are indistinguishable. This is a scan of water pipes in a mining tunnel. Early in mining's history, its primary use was for dust suppression after blasting. As mines got deeper and deeper, however, water was introduced as a coolant. So water was refrigerated into ice on the surface. It was then dropped down pipes to the rock face, sprayed onto the rock face. It was then purified through settling at the bottom and then pumped up again. So, water was used in this kind of massive refrigeration system. I won't go into any other details of the kind of things that water was used for. It's not important. What is important, however, is to note that in this process of moving through these mining voids, water was chemically transformed. Mining introduces oxygen to deep geology, where it has not been before. Air hasn't been down there amongst all those rocks before. And this results in the oxidation of the minerals in the mining voids. The most common of these minerals is pyrite, which is an iron sulfide, along with other toxic metals such as arsenic, cadmium, copper, cobalt, uranium, etc., etc. And as they oxidize, particularly the pyrite, it produces sulfuric acid, which, when it's exposed to water, produces a highly acidic saline solution in which heavy metals are mobilized. When mines are operational, water and water levels are stabilized by pumping. Okay, so the water's kept down there, it's pumped out, and it's a pretty stable situation. There's a stable water level at the bottom of the mine, and few metals are leached out from above. When mines close, however, and pumps are turned off, water starts to seek its natural piezometric level. Okay, the water level has had to be reduced, and the water level starts to rise and seek its original level. Rainwater obviously enters the abandoned shafts from above, and underground water reticulation systems leak. Slowly, the water levels rise, leaching out these chemical toxins, and they eventually decant onto the surface. In August 2002, the first recorded incident of acid mine drainage from a Witwatersrand gold mine took place. On the abandoned, appropriately called Harmony gold mine, to the west of Johannesburg, water began to decant onto the surface. At first, it received very little attention. It emanated from 2 abandoned mine shafts on a relatively remote mine and flowed into 2 seasonal watercourses. These turned yellow, as we saw. That's the kind of iron sort of starting to leach out. All aquatic life in these streams was killed, and a number of animals that relied on them for drinking water died, except for 2 hippo, which still wallow around in this dreadful pools and seem to be unaffected by it. Shortly after this, Robinson Lake, a mine waste site that had been sold by a mining company very, very quickly to a developer with plans to create a shopping centre, private residences and a hotel, was found to have water nearing a pH of 2, in other words, as acidic as vinegar, that contained elevated levels of uranium and heavy metals. It was declared a radiation hotspot and fenced off. In fact, it has higher levels of radiation than Chernobyl at the moment, this lake. Amberfield, a retirement village built nearby, was abandoned when it was shown to be exposed to radioactive airborne dust. And residents of Tudor Shaft, an informal settlement on a neighbouring mine dump, were found to have inhaled or ingested dangerous amounts of radioactive material. Now, what's going on here? Basically, the water had redistributed the underground across the surface of the Earth and into the atmosphere, making geology, metals, salts, oxides, and radioactive compounds, and politics, accommodations between government and mining houses, fraudulent mining acquisitions, etc., visible and knowable. Not as hidden abstractions or scientific facts any longer, but as above ground, but as forms of above ground experience and matters of concern. In other words, the water made the stuff experienceable and it made it evident. To paraphrase Rancière, that which had no right to be counted as a speaking being made itself of some account, setting up a community by the fact of placing in common the contradiction of 2 worlds in a single world, the underground and the above ground, the world where it was and the world where it was not, the world where there was nothing between it and those, the world where there was nothing, and the world where there was something between it and those who did not acknowledge it as a speaking being. That's a quote from Rancière, and I'm saying that actually the water did that. Unprecedented associations between scientists, activists, artists, politicians, newly floated companies, shack dwellers and farmers were assembled. Was this water about mining? Was it about waste? Was it about water resource management? Was it about air quality? Was it about health? Was it about land values? Was it about liability? Was it about ecological rehabilitation? To whom or what was it a matter of concern? The state, current mining houses, former mining companies, taxpayers, tour operators, shack dwellers, developers, hippo, fish, etc., etc. People who live far downstream because this water is running downstream and contaminating streams right across the country. People not yet born. If it is concerned to all of these and more, how did one put together an assembly that spoke a common language to discuss it, account for it, call it to order, assess its contradictory scenarios, and make decisions about how to deal with its consequences? Should this be in Parliament, in appointed committees, in public gatherings, in scientific journals, in art galleries, in the media, or in all of the above? By 2010, the water had become a national political crisis. Scientific debates emanated from research councils and spilled into the media. Global capital, British capital, in fact, flexed its muscles and floated a company on the British Virgin Islands with a proxy in South Africa to pump and purify the water and sell it back to mining companies. Artists revealed its consequences for health, crops and livestock. This is actually a wonderful piece of work called Ecovention by a young artist who really, in a beautiful installation, was looking at the ethical dimensions and consequences of this water. In a project that I conducted in Johannesburg in 2010 with a group of architectural students, we looked at the water as a proposition for new forms of infrastructure and new ways of reimagining what infrastructure was in the city. And in fact, there have been 2 theses, diploma theses, done on the acid mine water in Johannesburg more recently. Towards the end of that year, a parliamentary portfolio committee visited the contaminated sites. And in February 2011, this report was published entitled Mine Water Management in the Witwatersrand Goldfields, with a special emphasis on acid mine drainage. The report recommended the neutralization of the acidity in the water and pumping it to stabilize its levels underground in parts of the mining fields where it wasn't emerging already. A round of public meetings was held to rubber stamp the proposal, and this is one that I went to, which, sorry to repeat myself, John, was spectacularly boring. So there was this round of public meetings to kind of rubber stamp this proposal, and of course this was viewed as far from adequate by scientists and environmental activists who insisted that you couldn't just take the acid out of this water, that it was far too contaminated, and that a far more comprehensive approach should be adopted: desalination, removal of the heavy metals, removal of radioactive materials, etc., etc. I got this email, this innocuous little email towards the end of last year as a stakeholder to one of those meetings, which really says it all. It says here, although an exemption application has been made for the acid mine drainage environmental impact assessment, blah, 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 the scoping report for this impact assessment is available online. In other words, the state has gone through the appearance of conducting an environmental impact assessment, but they've applied to themselves for exemption from having to carry it out. So this actually is the end point of that series of public meetings. Okay, so what this truncated and rather depressing account of the ongoing political life of rising acid mine water reveals is that in reorganizing surface and depth into a sludgy, contested, fluid continuum, the water made it impossible to act as if what had formerly been 2 distinct realms, the above and the below, science and politics, humans and non-humans, capital and labor, those who know and those who don't know, those who deliberate and those who do not, those who give orders and those who obey, do not belong to the same sphere. Those used to positions of mastery, of course, continue to act as if ignorant of this. They issue orders as to whose utterances are valid and whose are not, and they fail to recognize that what is at stake is the very constitution of political life itself. The scandalous descent of rising acid mine water demonstrated for a brief moment that a common world does exist, that combinations between many systems are thinkable, and that a topography that does not presuppose a politics of verticality is possible. Whether these logics will prevail, or whether the dualities that I've described will be reasserted, and I suspect they have been already, will require ongoing vigilance that the equality as speaking beings of all the partners in the conflict is upheld. Thank you.